Writing that book helped me start a new chapter of my life in which I was the captain of my own ship.
Welcome to the Strokecast. A Generation X stroke survivor explores rehab, recovery, the frontiers of neuroscience, and how to peel a banana with one hand.
Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to the Strokecast. Over the past couple of years, I've talked to lots of people who, wrote books about their experience with stroke. You can read about a number of those and hear those interviews I did over at strokecast.com/authors. A memoir can be a great way to explore your own feelings about and, your relationship with a traumatic event like a stroke. But it's certainly not limited to stroke. It can also help you close a chapter in your life and open a new one. It can also be a great way to share your story in a cohesive way with family and friends in a way that they might not quite get from just regular updates by text messaging and Facebook posts. It's also a way that you can share your lessons and your story with the broader community and to help others who are just now going through a similar experience. But, that idea can, of course, be intimidating at first. The idea of writing a book is a big one, but it doesn't have to be. Last year, Christine H. Lee joined us in episode 51 to talk about her stroke and her memoir, Tell Me Everything You Don't Remember. Christine is an author, a teacher, and a stroke survivor. And this week, Christine is back to talk about memoir writing and what you need to know to write your own book. So now, let's learn from Christine. So Christine, thanks so much for coming back to Strokecast.
Glad to be here and glad to be a repeat guest.
I think let's get into the super controversial stuff right off the bat. Oxford comma, yes or no?
Yes.
Awesome.
In fact, my partner gave me a mug that says, I love eating my cat and drinking coffee.
That's awesome. That's better than the Kennedy and Stalin and strippers that we see pop up on the internet from time to time. And for those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, I'll talk more about the Oxford comma in the show notes. But for those into writing and typing, it is a big thing. Let's start off then. I know a lot of those of us who are not in the writing and literary space a lot, we hear a lot of these terms and use them interchangeably, but when we talk about a memoir, how is a memoir different from, say, an autobiography?
And that is a very good question. And as a teacher of writing, I often encounter people writing an autobiography when they mean to write a memoir. So a memoir is about a certain event in your life, whereas an autobiography is the entirety of a life, from birth to present time. And a memoir can go back and forth in time, but an autobiography is chronological. And as a result, most autobiographies are written by people who are notable or super famous, whereas a memoir can be written by anybody who has had a meaningful experience.
An autobiography then almost sounds like it is going to be definitely more of a linear type of story, more of a historical what happened, whereas, like I said, a memoir can go back and forth, can really focus more on the personal significance of an event and some of the squishier emotional stuff.
Absolutely. It has a greater emphasis on emotional experience and the interiority of an individual's experience.
For someone who is thinking about trying to share their story of surviving stroke or another traumatic experience or how it's changed their life and all of this stuff, that is definitely something that is more focused in the memoir space. We pick up a memoir to read about somebody's particular experience rather than to read about their life overall.
Exactly, because memoirs can be about anybody, and people read them because of their subject, theme, or writing style.
Okay, awesome. Whereas an autobiography, you read that because of the person specifically.
Absolutely.
So what is involved then in writing a memoir? How do you pull that off? How do you put that together? Where do you start?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, there has to be a meaningful experience in your life that you want to unpack for others. And I firmly believe that there's universality in the particular. So the more specific you can be about what you went through and survived, the more universal it is for your reader. And to learn what the lessons are in overcoming your setback. It's about understanding what happened to you, and also the journey you took in navigating that experience.
I like that phrase a lot, the universality in the particular, in that the deeper and more specific you get into your story, the broader the truths that can emerge from it.
Yes.
I also think it's really interesting, too, when you talk about that it's about sharing your understanding of the event. There's almost understanding that comes out of actually writing and actually of telling the story itself.
Yes. So I found with my students, oftentimes people will write their first draft in present tense, because I think in the first draft, you have to write everything down. And then in the second draft, what happens is curation, because memoir writing is not about writing everything that happened to you, but picking and choosing the events and how they string together in a narrative that brings meaning to you and to the reader. Like I used to joke when I was a kid to my dad, why do people never go to the bathroom on TV, on sitcoms? And of course they do, but it's not relevant to the show. So you don't have to tell every single thing that happened that day or that month, but you get to choose the things that are most important and that give structure to your story. And of course, it's about what you can remember.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think when we talk about that, I think that may be where some people get hung up. There's so much, and they don't know where to start. And really, you just need to start and get it all down and cut later. And there is, I mean, one of the most powerful people on a film when we talk about, big movies, it's, the director and the actors, and that's all important. But it's the editor who actually goes ahead and creates the story. And, it's that editing, it's that trimming out of stuff that doesn't feed to the greater point, which improves a talk, it improves a podcast episode, to writing that book. I think when I talked to Jan Douglas a few weeks back about her book, she, her initial draft of her story was, 2 or 3 times longer than the final version.
Yeah. And there are overwriters who have to cut, and there are quote unquote underwriters who have to add. I'm unfortunately an underwriter, so I have to feather in more information in subsequent drafts.
Interesting. I'm actually going through the condo buying process right now, so I'm dealing with an entirely different kind of underwriter.
That's why I said underwriter in quotes.
Exactly. Have you always been an underwriter, or do you think that is partially the result of your stroke and the challenges you had there?
I think I've always been an underwriter. And for me, it's about getting the structure and the framing down on paper before I can figure out how to tell that story and what information is needed for the entire narrative arc. And figuring out what the lessons are and making sure that all of the scenes and events are linked to that end. Whereas for a lot of people, you have to get everything down. And then what you do is curate and figure out what of those scenes you're going to keep and how they link up. It's like people who need to outline before they write an essay. versus people who feel stymied by an outline. I know there is no one set way to write. I think a challenge and critical thing for a writer to know how it is they write in order to write a book.
That's an interesting thought too. I hadn't really considered the two different approaches when we talk about that, the outline, the pro outline versus the hostile outline folks. In school, I was always against outlines and always just focused on just writing straight and doing what I could and producing those one draft wonders, which really weren't quite all that wonderful. Now I find when I whether I'm talking about putting together a speech or learning module or whatever it is I'm creating, personally, I find I have to have that outline first, do the outline and then fill in from there. But, that's definitely not how everybody approaches it.
Yeah. And so it's just like some people are visual learners and other people are auditory learners. It helps for me to see something in order to process it. But for others, they'd rather listen. We're all different.
One of the important lessons I've had to learn is that when you create something, when you write something, you have to be willing to get rid of some of the awesome stuff if it doesn't fit your overall larger narrative.
I know, it's heartbreaking. Just because I'm an underwriter, it doesn't mean that I don't edit stuff out. And it's painful. So what I always do is create a separate document called pathology. And when I cut stuff, I put the things right in there. And so I don't feel like I've thrown it away and that it's living somewhere. Occasionally, I use it for essays and inspiration for subsequent work.
So the deleting stuff doesn't necessarily mean we have to get rid of it. It's not a no, it's a not now.
Exactly, or not there. And it is soothing to think about it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't have to kill your babies. Just put them to the side.
Yes.
I mean, obviously this is a process of getting everything out, fitting it in there, doing the editing, doing the processing. It's a challenge for most folks, but how do you navigate this process with the added challenges of a brain injury, whether it's the lingering aphasia, memory challenges, the neurofatigue, all that stuff that goes along with the situation we find ourselves in?
I mean, it's a challenge. I am very grateful for the fact that I have a journal and I could look at it and pick and choose. For others, it will mean leaving yourself audio notes, like on your phone. It will mean writing much more slowly, but it's all possible. I took a lot of rests because I just got tired.
And this is hard work. When we're talking about, physical exercise, obviously that stuff is hard work, but working the brain, those of us who've been through this, we know that just the thinking through and the writing and all of that is hard work. We are burning a ton of brain cycles to do that. And rest and breaks become so important to that process.
Absolutely. When I was in the initial recovery stages from my stroke, I would write 20 minutes and then have to take an hour nap. And then I would continue. So that's just how it is for some people. And just to know that even for neurotypical people or people without chronic illness, writing a book takes a year at least. And it's not a fast process. And every book takes the time it takes.
Every book takes the time it takes. I like that. I like that. So, as you're going through this, how do you tell your story in a way that stays true to yourself and yet is entertaining and engaging for readers and doesn't just become self-indulgent?
That is the key to a good memoir. And it entails curating your events and getting very, very specific. Because I think what readers want is to feel like they're overhearing a conversation between two other people. And the more specific you get, the more of a clear picture you're drawing for others. And the more emotionally true you are, the more engaging and authentic your narrative is. So it's not really about telling people like, this is the way you do it. It's not a how-to, but it's about how you managed. I was really scared that I was writing a self-pitying memoir. And so I was really conscious of that while I was writing Tell Me Everything You Don't Remember, because I was very aware of what will my readers get out of my experience. And it came down to being very, very, very specific and emotionally true.
That's a lot of it. That's then that focus on the audience. What are you delivering to them? What value are they going to get out of this, instead of just sort of focusing on the value that you personally are going to get out of it?
Yeah, but also you cannot think of the audience the whole time while you're writing your memoir. You have to think about what it meant to you, what the lessons you learned were, and the emotional intensity of that journey. And then the more true you are to yourself, the more you'll engage your audience. And it's like you just don't want to be self-conscious, and you just have to write for yourself or to a very specific individual. It's almost like writing a letter to someone.
That's a great approach to that. I think one of the things that comes to mind when you say that, when you talk about that, it's one of the things I talk about on my public speaking show, and that's that truth. When we talk about truth and what is going to be true to an audience and true in a communication, it's not just about the facts. We can go back to Aristotle, who talks about the triangle of logos, pathos, and ethos. The logos is sort of the facts of the situation. The pathos is the emotional connection from that communication. The ethos is the credibility of the author. The actual truth for the audience is going to emerge when all three of those things can come together.
Absolutely. And it's echoed in the author, narrator character of your story too. And it's tricky in memoir writing because you're the author, you're also the narrator, and you're also the character. And as the author, you have sort of an intention of telling this story about yourself. And the narrator is the person who's telling the story at a fixed point in time, whereas the character is living out that narrative. And it's really important to separate the three, because the narrator is the one who's providing hindsight wisdom, and the character is not quite there yet.
That's a really interesting perspective. I'm going to have to spend some time thinking about that one too.
That's what I teach my graduate level students. And it's something that's really important to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. So, there's a lot for those students to learn then. What mistakes do you typically see a lot of the first-time memoirs making then?
It's really that author-narrator character merge, where we're not sure where the narrator is in time, because part of why you have to separate those is because the narrator knows what the lessons are and the character does not. And oftentimes when there is a kind of squishing of the narrator and character is when the character starts narrating and the dialogue is all about information about what just happened, as opposed to showing the voice of the character and their own confusion. And then at the same time, if there's no narrator, there's also no framework. And then also sometimes a narrator becomes the character, and the character doesn't get to live on the page. We don't really get to see what's happening. And we also don't get the wisdom because the narrator is blending with the character. And so the result is dialogue where it's almost like on CSI, where you're like, hi, I'm going to spray luminol on this. You see, luminol will illuminate the blood in the room or body fluids in the room. And it happens a lot on TV to explain for the audience. Whereas in literature, you want the narrator to say that and for the character to just spray the luminol.
Almost sort of like for those who watch Arrested Development, Ron Howard's voiceover that come in as the outside narrator to clarify things.
Absolutely. So the narrator knows a lot more than those characters. And that is an example of how that's all separated out. Interesting.
And, I think that, and there's a lot of different ways to play with that too. I think, a couple of weeks ago, I talked with Julia Fox Garrison about her book, and she wrote 85% of it in second person as she talked about her experience of going through stroke, which was, I suppose it's I don't think it was necessarily intended that way, but it's sort of a way of imposing some of that outside structure as well.
Yes. Second person's really tricky because it's a very commanding voice where you're telling people how they feel. And when done well, it's amazing because it's very authoritative, but at the same time, it can isolate the reader. So that's a POV that I always tell people, or point of view that I always tell people to choose wisely.
Mm-hmm. And sort of one of those things to play with through the revision process, because as you start writing, just because you started writing and started typing doesn't mean that stuff is permanent. You can play with it and try it and edit it and change it and curate it throughout the whole thing.
Yes, and playing around is really important. I think that people take writing very seriously, as they should, but then we forget to play. Just because you don't know how it's going to end up or you have a specific vision for it doesn't mean you shouldn't try it in your manuscript, because you never know what will happen. Some of my best work comes out of this sense of play and experimentation.
So, I mean, you mentioned you're working with the graduate students, you're working with this whole process and teaching folks. So, for somebody who's thinking about writing their memoir, what role do sort of writing workshops or retreats play in the for the life of an aspiring writer, either somebody who always wanted to write or somebody who is really just coming to this the first time?
I think having a cohort is extremely important for every writer, to have a group of people that are going to be supportive of your writing. I started writing at a community college. It's actually an extension course, but basically a community college writing workshop. And it was incredibly supportive. My classmates and I kept in touch we actually still keep in touch, and it's now been almost 17 years.
Wow.
And we met long after the class ended and supported each other. So that camaraderie is very important in developing a community and continuing writing, and feeling like what you have to say is super important. And then, of course, you can advance and apply to summer writing workshops and MFA programs and such. But I think that it doesn't matter where you start, but I think that community support is important. At one point, I attended the Squaw Valley Writers Workshop on medical writing, and that was really helpful for me too in meeting cohorts. I think that people devalue the idea of cohorts in writing because it's hard to write a book all by yourself, even though that's essentially what you're doing. And the value of a cohort and a supportive cohort is underestimated.
Yeah, I think that's, and there's this perception that writing is a solo activity. It's ideal for introverts because you can just sit there and write or type or whatever, and maybe go out and build your story at Starbucks or wherever you happen to be. But it's not just about that individual. It's not just about that that isolation. You do need that broader community.
Yeah, I mean, there will be days when you just want to throw your manuscript out the window. By the way, when that happens, congratulations, you're at least halfway through. It's a normal part of the process. But you need a cohort that says what you have to say is important and who supports your manuscript.
That's also one of those themes that we come back to on this show again and again, too, is that as a survivor, there's a lot of value in getting out there to the stroke support groups, getting out there to caregiver support groups, to all of these different communities, and not to just and to try and avoid just isolating yourself after stroke, because you need to be around people who are going through some of these similar challenges. You may need that added insight, that added sympathy, that added community. And a writing cohort is obviously the focus of the discussion is different, but there's a lot of those same emotional needs that can be met through that working with other writers.
Oh, yeah. You just brought up to me all the parallels. I think that people who have survived a huge event in their life, or in this particular case, surviving stroke, are uniquely qualified to write a novel or a book or an essay, because surviving nurtures a sense of resilience. And I think that writing a book requires a lot of resilience. It requires overcoming setbacks and skills that you can't finish a book unless you persevere. And I think that stroke survivors persevere. And that sense of support is the same, because as stroke survivors, it's up to us to do our own recovery. In the end, we're alone, sadly, but realistically. But at the same time, having things like StrokeNet and online support and in-person groups really facilitates our healing and helps us feel a little less alone. And strokes are also, every single stroke is unique and individual. There is no stroke that is exactly the same. And that's the same for memoirs. There is no memoir that is exactly the same, because each memoir comes from each individual's experience and lessons learned.
So we've that's so important. Those lessons are so important. And we've been talking a lot about some of the creative lessons and the construction lessons. Let's shift a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the practical and some of the business aspects of writing a book, because it's one thing to get your thoughts down and have this manuscript. Now you got to do something with it. So what do you think aspiring memoirists should know first about the business of writing?
I'm kind of torn, because it's good to have that knowledge of the business and the process of publishing, and to understand what a book proposal is, who an agent is, who an editor is. But at the same time, it can really backfire, because the business of writing is so different from the act of writing that it can stymie the writing process. I know writers who get stressed out when they hear about publishing, who get stressed out about what they need to have prepared once their manuscript is done, or while their manuscript is being written, and it can stymie the creative process. For a long time while I was writing, I refused to go to publishing panels and stuff, because it would just stress me out. But at the same time, it's important to learn that there is something called an agent. Most people want an agent. You don't always have to have an agent. There are publishing houses, and each one has its own personality and specialty. And there is something called a book proposal that you probably have to be aware of, even if you don't write one, in order to sell your book and all of that. But at the same time, in the end, you have to finish your manuscript. And I think that overall, it's much more important to focus on your story and write a compelling memoir than it is to understand the business.
Yeah, and that's fair. And the business is changing so much these days, with everything from self-publishing to the hybrid models to traditional publishing. And there is going to be, if you can complete that manuscript, there is going to be a path forward for you. It's something that you can always come back to later on, after you've done the hard part of creating that manuscript. After you've birthed that there's no point in going ahead and picking the kindergarten before you've birthed the manuscript.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's important to have a kind of goal in mind while you write. Are you writing this just to, I just want to tell my story and I don't care if I'm going to self-publish it, head towards the hybrid route, or pitch it to a big house. But it's important to know if you're set on one goal, because some people are like, no, I don't want to deal with the publishing house. I'm going to self-publish this because I just want to hit the highest number of people I can, and I want control over the whole process, versus I am resolute on pitching it to a publishing house, and that's what I want to do. And I think that big picture is kind of important to have in mind as you go forward, to understand how malleable your goals are. But know that there is a way to get your work out. It doesn't have to happen in one way or another, but you have to decide how you want it to be read.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things too is, as we've seen the modern landscape change, a lot of times probably many of us are first approaching sharing our story through social media in a way that wasn't available, 10, 15 years ago. And sharing your story and parts of your story, whether that's going to be through blogs, podcasts, articles, YouTube channels, all of that, bits and pieces of our story gets out there. And for many folks, maybe that is enough. For other folks, these different places where you start sharing can also be a source for materials when you go ahead and write your memoir. But in your experience, you had the anonymous blog and the BuzzFeed articles before publishing your book. How does having all this content and all these parts of your stories out there, does that make it harder to get a book done or published, or because your story's out there, or is it enhance your chances because you already have a platform, some following, and some feedback?
I think having a platform is very, very important. And for people who are not familiar with the term, platform is like the thing that says why you have to tell this story, how you are an authority and someone who can get the story out. When I started writing about my stroke, I didn't have an intention to have it published. I just thought, I need my story to be told. So I published my stroke experiences on an anonymous blog called jadepark.wordpress.com. And I made a bunch of friends off that blog. It became an immense source of support for me in my recovery. And it became an immense a resource for me when I went to go write an essay about my stroke. And when I wrote about my essay about my stroke for BuzzFeed, which is called How I Had a Stroke at 20, I think it's titled I Had a Stroke at 33. I didn't do it to sell. I just did it to talk about what had happened to me and to reframe this experience. And for me, it was a closure to my healing, because I hadn't really been able to synthesize the whole experience in one set narrative, because until that point, I had been blogging about it on a daily basis. It was very surprising to me that people wanted to hear about it and that publishing houses wanted to publish a book about my experience. So it was like completely not my intention to write a memoir. It was not my intention to write nonfiction even, because my background is in fiction and novel writing. So, I mean, having that blog, having that essay helped me get a book deal. And platform is everything when you want to publish. So some people don't want to write short pieces of their manuscript because they're like, well, then it's already out there. And what am I writing this book for? Isn't it repetitive? No, it's not, because every single thing you write is going to be unique and it will attract readers. It will help you get your story told. It will help you heal. And so it serves so many purposes, all of which are good.
That's awesome. And that's so important. I think one of the things we get caught up in is that we know our story, or we think we know our story. And, through the process, we learn we didn't really know our story as well as we did, but we think we know it, and repeating it just seems repetitive and boring. And who's going to care about that again when I've already done this? Well, for most of our audience, our story is always new to them. It's just that we live and breathe it every day. And so we underestimate the novelty and the interest that other folks will have, because for us, it's just life. It's just, becomes, what we deal with day in, day out. And other folks don't have that same experience.
Exactly. I literally thought, who wants to hear about my stroke? Because in my real life, people didn't want to hear about it anymore, right? And I don't think that my story is unique there, because people want you to just get better really fast. They don't want to hear about your difficulties on a day-to-day basis. You get bored by your own difficulties. You just want to move past it, or at least I did. I'm so sorry for telling people what they want. See, there's the pedantic nature of the second person. But apparently people were really interested, and I was shocked by that. And I think that that's because having a stroke and surviving it is a comeback story. And it is about overcoming setbacks, and people love being inspired. And each of us has a story of inspiration.
So, going through this whole process, it's also still a fluid process as your story continues to evolve. And I think that's one of the powerful things about the memoir versus the autobiography. Autobiography, the facts of your life don't change. In a memoir, the value you get out of your experience can evolve and change with time as you explore it and as you share it. How would you say your story has changed since you wrote Tell Me Everything You Don't Remember? How would that be different if you started writing it today versus several years ago?
I think it would be significantly different, because I, as an author, have changed since I wrote it in 2014. It's been 5 years. And therefore, if I narrated it from 2019, my understanding of my stroke and my life also has changed. Because at the time I wrote it while going through a divorce, my husband of 18 years had just left me with a newborn, and I didn't really understand what was happening at that time with regards to that part of my life. And all I knew was that I was going through so much heartbreak that I had to find resources within myself. And to know that I had survived a stroke helped me get through this huge heartbreak in my life. And to unpack the lessons I'd learned from my stroke so that I could get through abandonment was critical. But now it's been 5 years since. So I am sure how I view my stroke would have been different. Instead of like a touchstone, it may have really, I don't know how I'd write it today, but I know it would be different. I would possibly weave my marriage and the stroke more tightly. Whereas at the time, I refused to write about my divorce, because I barely understood it at the time.
Fascinating. I think that's really interesting how your story evolves over time. And one of the reasons that occurred to me to ask that was that when I read your book, you seemed very neutral or more positive about your ex. And it seems like over the last few months, just from following you on Instagram and Twitter, that tone and that perception has changed to a more negative view there.
Yeah, I think I'm more comfortable with what happened. He's certainly a human being who makes mistakes. I think at the time I was in a state of shock. I certainly had some Stockholm syndrome. And I was in a state of mind where I didn't know what to think, and I didn't want to harm my daughter. And so I decided to just be neutral about my then husband, or my ex-husband, who I've nicknamed Adam in my book. And then I realized, I mean, one of the biggest pieces of feedback or criticism that books has gotten is that people wanted to know more about my marriage. And I felt really resolute that I wouldn't talk about my marriage. But I'm sure that today I would probably unpack it more because I'm much more secure in my feelings about my marriage, about, more secure that my opinion matters. I suspect that if I wrote a book about it, it still would be more balanced than I would be on Twitter because Twitter is sometimes emotionally charged and occurs right after a current time event. But we become more confident in our own truths as time goes by.
I mean, what impact do you think that book has in your life today? What has it brought you?
Oh, it's been life-changing. Writing that book helped close a chapter in my life. Writing that book got me through possibly the worst year of my life. Writing that book helped me start a new chapter of my life in which I was the captain of my own ship. Writing that book opened up a whole new career for me, and writing that book was a dream come true. And the funniest thing of all is that it came out of a huge setback in my life. So, one of the things that I learned from that time period was that every setback is an opportunity. And of course, I wasn't like that. I wasn't Miss Pollyanna about everything, but that saying held true for this book. Like, if I hadn't had a setback, I wouldn't have had the opportunity of the book. And the opportunity of this book has opened up more opportunities for me. And certainly, I am not the kind of person who's like, always looking around saying, wow, this is so great. Something crappy happened and I'm just going to look at it as an opportunity. But you can always steer your book around. And even surviving my stroke has helped me understand invisible disabilities. I acknowledge that I am extremely privileged in that I've done well in school and certain cognitive things have come very easy to me, but having experienced a time in my life where I was unable to do addition, unable to remember, dependent on every single person to even order things off a menu, opened up a whole new world in helping me empathize and to understand what it's like to not have that. And that too is an opportunity. It wasn't fun, but it has helped me be more sympathetic. And now that I'm an educator and a writer, that empathy and ability to accommodate has been huge because I have literally been in some of my students' shoes in terms of, for example, learning disabilities. And I know, Bill, you have been incredibly accommodating because you know that I have no very few auditory learning capabilities. And, you sent me an outline of this interview so that I can visualize the questions and track things much better. So this is the kind of empathy that makes us better human beings. And that's why I think stroke survivors are uniquely qualified to write a memoir because we are informed by our experiences and it makes us more empathetic human beings. And who better to write a memoir than somebody who is empathetic?
And I think, on that concept a little bit about that empathy, you mentioned the word privilege. I like to think I always had sort of an intellectual understanding of what we talked about, what folks were talking about when they talked about the idea of privilege. But as a heteronormative CIS white guy, I didn't really have, the intrinsic sense until I started, until the stroke and started understanding things like abled privilege. It's like, oh, that's it.
Yeah. You don't know it until it's gone. And we don't know the ability of a function in our body until it's truly gone. And if we're lucky, it comes back, at some point, partially, if not wholly. but very few people get to experience that. I always tell people the world could be better if we had a machine that helps us have the experiences of others, if we could switch bodies with somebody else for a day and literally walk in their shoes. And I think stroke, and if you recover from it, or, it helps you understand what it's like to have a disability, live with it, whether it's visible or invisible. And if you suffered a setback in your life, it makes you a much more empathetic human being, as opposed to somebody who suffered zero setbacks. I personally think that people who have suffered zero setbacks are likely to be unbearable.
And you've just found a great social justice justification for developing polyjuice potion. So, what other projects do you have in the offing?
Well, I have a column up at Catapult Story, which is catapult.co. I write a column about my urban farm and beekeeping as it pertains to politics and personal development. And I am working on rewriting my novel. And hopefully I'll make that deadline, and it will be out from Ecco, Harper Collins in the next few years.
Awesome. And I love following your stories on social. So folks want to know more about your chickens or your bees or you. Where should they go?
I think the easiest place to go is Twitter. And my login there is XTIN as in Nancy EHLEE. And I tweet there, and there are links to my Catapult column off my profile. And I announce any of my new writings there as well as my general musings. People always ask me what my brand is. And I'm like, I don't know. I'm horrible at this. I just talk about my daily happenings, try to inject some humor, and try to give people a reason to laugh each day.
That's awesome. And we're going to have all those links also over in the show notes in this episode over at strokecast.com. And that brings us to our hack of the week.
The most important advice I can give is to keep writing, because I have seen many, many talented writers not publish. And the reason they don't publish is that they give up. And the most critical thing for writing is to be the kind of person who doesn't give up. And I think that stroke survivors, again, we have no choice but to not give up. And so we understand what it means to persevere. And each of your stories have value. Each of your stories are unique and need to be told.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us this week. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you for having me. I truly enjoy talking on Strokecast, and I can say that because now I've been on second time.
Absolutely, and we'll have to work on the third time.
Yay.
There were lots of great things in this conversation, and one that jumps out at me is that Christine and I, of course, talked about our strokes because, well, they make us who we are today. At the same time, though, the conversation itself isn't about stroke. It's about writing and what authors need to know. Christine's advice isn't specific to stroke survivors. It applies to anyone who has gone through a major event and wants to share it with the world. In a stroke-focused podcast, it's easy to get caught up in the idea of stroke. I mean, it's why we're all part of this community. It informs who we are, but it doesn't define who we are. You see, we're also writers and speakers and teachers and trainers and Harry Potter fans and parents and kids and friends and coworkers and bus passengers and so much more. You see, stroke and disability impact all of those relationships and characteristics, but they don't erase them. A conversation like we had today lets us share the expertise we do have beyond our stroke survivor status or our current health or our current disabilities. I mean, you can walk into any stroke support group meeting and listen to people's stories. The things that we have in common are healing and empowering, but the things about us that are different are also fascinating. The roads and lives that got us in that same room are different with their own flavor. We bring widely varied lives to this community, and we live varied lives as part of this community. And that's why, despite all the survivor stories that have already been written, there is still room for your personal, powerful, one-of-a-kind story. So the question is simply, will you tell it? To learn more about Christine, find her book, or follow her on social media, visit the show notes at strokecast.com/writeyourstory. Share this episode with your writing group, aspiring writers you know, English teachers, therapists, or anyone else who may have a story to tell. Give them the link, strokecast.com/writeyourstory. Start working on your memoir and let me know about it. And of course, as always, don't get best. Get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you soon.
The Strokecast, Bill Monroe, and Bill's guests provide general information and entertainment, not medical advice. Please do not make any changes to your treatment plan or the execution of your treatment plan without first consulting your personal doctor or medical team. The Strokecast is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.